This morning's reading is from John chapter 5, verses 1 to 15. After this, there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there is a pool called in Hebrew Beth Zatha, which has 5 porticos. In these lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that day was a Sabbath, so the Jews said to the man who had been cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your mat." But he answered them, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Take up your mat and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take it up and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had disappeared in the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well.
Good morning. My name is Brian Culbertson. I am a pastor at Refuge Church over in Fort Myers, which I know most of you are familiar with. Those in my church home who are used to hearing me speak every week, they know I have some acronyms that I like to use, and they've just grown accustomed to them. So I'm going to teach a couple of them to you. Maybe you'll want to use them in your life. The first one is PBC. Anybody have any idea what that means? When you see something crazy happening and people being crazy, you just say PBC. People be crazy. PBC. We've got another favorite one. It's PLC. Now, PLC, this one came from, my daughter's name is Presley Lynn Culbertson. Some of you have met her. When she was a baby, we had a diaper that somebody had given us, and it was embroidered. It was like a diapered cover, and it had on the back PLC, Presley Lynn Culbertson. My niece was living with us that summer, and she said, "Why did you put Poor Life Choices on your daughter's diaper?" So in my life, I use these words PBC, people be crazy, to justify crazy actions that people do, or PLC, when I do something really dumb, I said PLC, Poor Life Choices. I've got one more that I've been using a lot recently, and it's CYS. CYS, it's Choose Your Suffering. And as I began to use this, it not only changed the way I saw suffering, but it changed the way I began to view life itself. Because in life, we are always choosing. And so let me give you a scenario. Imagine, back in your heyday, 20s or 30s, and you're in great shape, and somebody came up to you, and they stuck a gun to your head, and they said, "I'm going to kill you or your family unless you go run a marathon. 26.2 miles. Be pretty awful, right? A lot of pain, a lot of suffering. Maybe you could get through it, but it would not be a pleasant experience, perhaps the worst experience of your life. Now imagine you're in your prime, you went out and bought some running shoes, some new athletic gear, and then you began to train for months and months, and you really got into running. And you trained and you signed up for the Chicago Marathon, and at the marathon there at the finish line were your friends and family just cheering you on as you crossed that finish line. Same marathon, same 26.2 miles, but one was very painful and one was very powerful. Again, it's the exact same 26 miles. It's the same person that's running the race. It's the exact same pain coursing through the exact same legs. But when the suffering was forced upon you against your will, it's one of the most painful experiences of your life. But when you chose the suffering freely, it was powerful. See, choice in suffering gives suffering meaning. And when we infuse suffering with meaning, it can be transformed from painful to powerful. It can turn us from victim to victor. Now, I don't know everybody in this room this morning, but I can take some guesses here. If we were to add up all the people in this room today who have struggled with depression or anxiety, or who have gone through some extreme emotional turmoil, or who have suffered through some personal health battles, or who have lost loved ones, well, there'd be nobody left out. That would be every single person in this room, because nobody makes it through life without collecting a few scars along the way. It's because suffering is unavoidable. But oftentimes we get the opportunity to choose our suffering. Or at the very least, we get to choose what our suffering means. And so we're going to look at that story from John chapter 5. John is one of my favorite authors in Scripture, very ethereal. I love the way he writes. And he begins with this in verse 1. I'll read it again. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. John is very ambiguous in his language. He doesn't often give a lot of details because details don't matter. He wants to tell you about Jesus. Verse 2, he says, "Then there were in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades." Again, John is usually very general, but here he gives some very specific details. And when John gives a very specific detail, we should pay attention. He says this is the sheep gate. Now, the people John were writing to, they would know about this place. They would say the sheep gate. Okay, that's the place in the temple where the sheep were brought in for sacrifice. And so this is basically the loading docks and the animal kill shelter right there at the entrance of the temple. And this pool is called Bethesda. The literal meaning of that is house of mercy. And so immediately we're seeing this swimming pool in our minds. We're not thinking of the Ritz-Carlton swimming pool with pink umbrellas and guys serving drinks. This is a difficult, dark place. Verse 3 says, "Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed." And so this is a dirty, miserable place. It's desperate people in desperate situations. Some of them are hoping for miracles. Most of them are there just waiting to die. John goes on in verse 5. He says, "One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years." It's a long time. This man has been sitting there by this pool. And so he saw all the sights and the sounds, the sick, the disabled, the people who were there day after day and year after year. He heard all the sounds. The crying, the yelling, the begging, the praying. And worst of all, he smelled all the smells. You know, these people can't bathe, they can't get up, they can't go to the bathroom, and so they're just sitting there in their sores, lying in their filth. This is not the kind of place you would want to visit. But it's exactly the kind of place that Jesus always visits. Verse 6 says, "When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, 'Do you want to get well?'" That's the question. So let's just summarize here. We have a man who's been lying at this pool most of his life, suffering. No family, no job, no purpose. And along comes Jesus, and he asks a dumb question. Do you want to get well? I mean, this guy has to be thinking, do I want to get well? Okay, Captain Obvious, I'm sitting here in my own filth. I've got sores all over my body because I can't move. What kind of ridiculous question is, do I want to get well? If Jesus is God, and he is omniscient, and he is walking among us, does Jesus ask a question because he doesn't know the answer? Or is there another purpose? Jesus already knows this man's deepest desires. And so he's not looking to learn from this question, he's looking to teach. Self-awareness. Are you self-aware? Do you know what's happening with your feelings? If you're feeling today a certain way. If you're feeling happy today, do you know why? Do you understand? If you're feeling upset, do you know why? If you're sad today, have you really dived into why you're feeling sad? Or maybe you're bored today. You're like, yeah, Brian, I'm aware that I'm bored because this sermon is going nowhere right now. And I would say, okay, all right, I get it. You're getting nothing out of it. And you're like, no, not really. I've heard all this before. I've been around church a long time. And I'd say, okay, so you're bored because you think you already know everything. Yep. Could that be a humility issue? And you might reply, yeah, maybe, sometimes. But this is still boring, Brian. And I would say, well, does this boredom stem from a belief that everything must always be exciting, that you always have to be productive, or that every sermon that you hear needs to be for you and maybe not somebody else in the room? See, self-exploration, self-awareness. We all have those emotional blind spots where we're not very aware of why we think and do and say the things that we say. And so when Jesus asks the question, do you want to get well? It's a valid question. And it causes this man to have to pause and think, why do I feel like my circumstances are bad? How do I measure my bad circumstances? How do I define better? What does better actually look like, and will it actually be better when I get to that? And so let's do a little practice here this morning. I'm going to walk you through this. I want you to think of something right now that is just really bringing you down, something that's really bumming you out in your life right now. Maybe it's a broken relationship, maybe it's some financial stress, maybe it's a health concern. Just bring that to your mind. And then I want you to think, why is that bothering you? Think deeply. Why is that thing bothering you? What emotion is it bringing to the surface? Why are you feeling that emotion? What did you hope would be different? How can you change the situation? Or if it can't be changed, what do you need to accept about the situation? How can I learn? How can I grow? That's self-awareness. That's self-reflection. And so let's go back to the story a little bit. This pool is a desperate place. It's a place where people come to have their lives changed. It's a place where people come to be healed. This place is kind of like a church, right? And I talked to my church about this last night, and I said this. I said, true or false, everyone who comes to church wants to be well. Is that true or false? Or would some people rather come to church but still keep sitting in their mess? And we have that problem sometimes in our church. Maybe you do here. I've got a decade of church leadership. And so I've seen it. People will show up to church and they'll tell me about how they were hurt by their prior church or some trauma in their lives or their desire for healing from addiction or from some sin they're dealing with or how they feel alone and they just really want to be a part of a community. They want to be well. But do they want to be well? Do they actually want to be well? It sounds like a dumb question, but then I don't see them for weeks or months. I don't see them making any investment into relationships or into studying God's Word or into serving other people. Typically what I see with a lot of folks is I see them seeking out others that will allow them to wallow in their mess instead of calling it out of it. Do you really want to be well? There's a thing in culture today, it's called victimhood chic. A lot of people have this victim mentality. It's very much in style. We know this, and it's very seductive because being the victim absolves us from any responsibility. It's a whole lot easier to blame others than to take responsibility. And why do we do this? And we all do from time to time. Why do we do this? Because it feels good. It's a temporary high. Moral indignation feels good, and it can even become addicting to the point of victimhood chic. But it's hard to grow if you only see yourself constantly as the victim. Now, this man in our story, he's clearly in a desperate state. But before Jesus changes his situation, he's guiding him towards personal reflection. Jesus is saying to this man, why do you actually want to be well? Have you explored your motivations? What metrics will you use to determine what wellness looks like? These are deeply introspective questions, the kind of questions that most of us rarely pause to ask ourselves or even more so even discuss with others. Why am I doing this? Why am I not doing that? What do I believe will make me well? What voids in my life am I trying to fill? This crippled man, he wants to be healed, but why? Stop the pain? Probably. To find some happiness? Perhaps. To live his best life now? Well, here's how the man's going to respond to Jesus' question. The man says, "Sir, I have no one to help me get into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." A little victim mentality happening here. He's saying, "I see what you're saying, that I need to get into the pool when the water's stirring," but the man says, "No, I already tried that. It won't work. I can't walk. I have no friends. Someone else is always getting ahead of me." See, victimhood is not a new thing. It's been around for thousands of years. But here's the thing. Maybe you missed it. Did Jesus tell this man to do anything? He asked a simple yes or no question. Do you want to be well? That's it. Verse 8 says, "Then Jesus said to him, 'Get up, pick up your mat, and walk.'" Jesus says, "Do you want to be healed? Then get up. Get out of your mess. Get out of this misery that you're sitting in. And by the way, go ahead and take that stinky old mat with you so you remember what you walked away from." Paul writes in Philippians 3, "I focus on this one thing, forgetting the past and looking forward to what lies ahead. I press on to reach the end of the race and receive the heavenly prize for which God, through Christ Jesus, is calling us." It's tough to press on if you stay sitting in the dirt. And so maybe it is at this point that this man begins to do some introspection and begins to think really about Jesus' question, do I want to get well? I mean, I'm sitting here all day. It's pretty rough. It's smelly. It's stinky. But now what? If I get up and walk, I got to get a job. I got to find a place to live. I got to become a part of a community. I got to take responsibility for my life. And I need to honor this healing that I've been given. Which suffering do I choose? And so that's why I use this phrase, choose your suffering. And generally, most people, we just want a carefree, happy life. We want to fall in love. We want to have great relationships. We want to make some money, and we want to be well respected. But suffering is inevitable. And so what Jesus is doing with this man is he's giving them the option to choose his suffering. He's saying, what pain are you willing to accept in your life? What are you willing to struggle for? I told you this has become very popular in our family, and so this is a game we kind of play. We look at suffering A and suffering B. And so we'll say, okay, suffering A, option A is if I don't take care of my body and I don't eat right, I'm going to age poorly. I'm going to spend more time in hospitals. I'm going to have triple bypass surgery. That certainly is suffering A. So the alternative is I can choose a different suffering, suffering B. I can get up, I can pick up my mat, and I can join a gym. But that creates more suffering, right? Because the gym's not a lot of fun, and I got to get out of bed, and I got to go to the gym, and got to take showers at the gym. That's not very fun. Or I got to wait 10 minutes to get to my locker because some naked guy is taking up all the space while he watches Everybody Loves Raymond. It's a true story. Or maybe it goes like this. Suffering A, my marriage isn't well. I'm really suffering through this marriage, and we're fighting all the time, and I just feel like we're falling out of love. And so I say, I want to make my marriage well. Okay, but are you willing to choose suffering B of maybe having to go to some marriage counseling? Or suffering C, maybe reading some books about marriage? Or suffering D, going on date nights and eating at a place nobody likes because no one can ever make a choice? Or suffering E, maybe I got to change something about myself. And so we have to ask ourselves, do I choose suffering B, C, D, or E? Or maybe I don't actually value a strong marriage, and I'd rather choose the suffering of seeing my kids every other weekend on Christmas. Choose your suffering. I recently went on a trip to Orlando. You know they got a White Castles in Orlando now? Yeah, I don't know any of you from the Midwest like me, but I love some White Castles. I hadn't had them in a long time, so I ate 10 of them. I chose my suffering for many days. My family's not here today, and I was talking to some folks earlier. For my family to not be here today, I hate preaching when my family, especially my wife's not in the room. And so this is suffering for me because they're not here. I'd like them to be here, but I chose the suffering instead of raising independent kids. My oldest kid just got back home from a semester in Europe. She traveled over Europe last year and took some classes, and now she was home and she spent 1 week with us before they got in the car this morning to drive back to Indiana to finish her final semester and do her internship. And so my wife and daughter are driving to Indiana today, but she's independent, and I'm proud of that independence. I got one working as a barista this morning, one with a friend on a sleepover, raising independent children, but it brings about suffering because now they're not here with me. Now they're not here this summer with me. But I chose that suffering because raising an independent kid was better than the suffering to me of them living in my bonus room when they were 50 getting their AARP card. Choose your suffering. May not sound that exciting, but the reality is we live in a broken world. There's going to be suffering, and oftentimes we are given the choice to choose our suffering. So we could choose to live in denial, and we can always try to escape suffering and find temporary happiness and try to avoid suffering at all costs, but we know that's not possible. We can assume a victim's mentality. We can just blame others for our suffering and circumstances, and that can feel good sometimes in the short term. Or we can choose to look deep within ourselves. We can define our values, and then based upon those values, we can choose our suffering. You may say, I value starting a business, so I'm going to choose the suffering of risk and failure and crazy, insane hours. Or we may say, I value stopping to make poor life choices, and so I'm going to choose the suffering of letting go of friends who make me feel good about my bad choices, and I'm going to choose the suffering of going out and find new friends that will call me out with painful truth. We may say, I value great relationships, which means I'm going to have to choose the suffering of having tough conversations and awkward silences and the emotional turmoil that comes from relationships. And maybe you're saying, well, what about the really awful events? The suffering I didn't get to choose, that was just bestowed upon me. I mean, no one would certainly choose the suffering of being robbed or enduring a hurricane or living with lifelong chronic pain. But there's still power in choosing how we suffer, even within that inflicted suffering. No one would choose to lose a child. I've had several friends that have lost kids at a young age, and I can't imagine a more worse suffering. But I've seen many of those friends also choose to pick up their mat and walk into that tragedy and walk through that suffering. They've suffered by starting a charitable foundation in their child's name. They suffered by working through their suffering with a therapist. They've chose the suffering of consoling others, no matter how difficult there is in their own pain that they felt. They chose the suffering, some days, of just sitting in the pain and embracing the memories and the tears as they came. Choosing how we suffer doesn't alleviate suffering, but it can bring some healing and some wellness to our joy-starved souls. I want to read to you from the King James Version of the Bible. I don't do that often. I call it the William Shakespeare version. But it writes it like this. It says, when Jesus saw him lie and knew that he had been now a long time in that case, he saith unto him, wilt thou be made whole? Just a different way of asking the same question. Wilt thou be made whole? But that's kind of the ultimate question on our lives. Wilt thou be made whole? We live in a world that is marred by sin and suffering. And we have a holy God who was outside of that suffering, who freely chose his suffering by entering into our suffering. Paul writes again in Philippians 2, he says, Jesus gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. The cross was never forced upon Jesus. He willfully chose to suffer because he knew what he valued. He valued me, and he valued you. And through the resurrection, he showed us that suffering isn't ever the end of the story. It's simply a catalyst for new life. And so Jesus asks us all a question. Doesn't tell you to do anything. He simply asks a question. Do you want to be well? Wilt thou be made whole? It's a yes or no question, but it's going to require some self-reflection, some self-awareness. And so we get the two choices again. Suffering A, we stay in our mess. We stay in our sin. We stay in our death. We stay in a life chasing after things that we think will make us well but never feel complete. Or we choose the other suffering, suffering B. We get up, we carry our mats, and we allow Jesus to reveal our hearts. We choose the suffering of allowing Jesus to show us our impure motives. We choose the suffering of loving our neighbors even when we don't want to. We choose the suffering of showing mercy when we want vengeance. We choose the suffering of carrying those stinky old mats so we're reminded of who we once were before Jesus. Do you want to be well? Choose your suffering. Thank you, guys.